Hi, welcome to today's vlog. Today I'm going to be talking about what it was like to be in a wheelchair. As you may or may not know, I recently went on holiday to Florida to Disney and Universal. You might not know, I mean, I've barely mentioned it. I haven't really talked about it very much, so you might not have heard that I went to Disney. But I did. I went to Disney and I had a whale of a time. Before we went, there was sort of a lot of discussions about how I would cope with the walking, because if you've ever been to Disney or even just a regular theme park in the UK, you will know that there is a lot of walking. There's a lot of queuing, there's a lot of standing around, which isn't something I'm very good at. It is not one of my life skills. Sitting down I'm really good at, standing up and walking not so much. I was really apprehensive about accepting a wheelchair. I've only been in a wheelchair a couple of times in my life. Once when, possibly twice, I don't remember the first time maybe, I had to have both of my legs operated on at the same time and I wasn't allowed to walk and I needed a wheelchair. More recently we hired a wheelchair, no, tell a lie, we bought a wheelchair, like one of those cheap horrible fold-up ones, so that I could go to the Shrewsbury Flower Show and not be in a lot of pain. And we've also hired a wheelchair once or twice when I've been to Blackpool, just to sort of get me around a little bit easier. The time we hired it to go to Blackpool was before I'd had surgery on my hip and my left ankle, and I was in quite a lot of pain and couldn't walk very far at all. So the wheelchair was just hired to make it a little bit easier for myself. But those times that I have been in a wheelchair, it's not been for very long. It's been for minutes, sort of 20-30 minutes if that, and I've hated every second of it. So accepting that I was going to need a wheelchair for these 2 weeks while I was on holiday was a little bit of a struggle, but in the end I weighed it up. Do I be in a wheelchair or do I do lots of walking, injure myself and not enjoy the holiday? So the sensible thing to do was hire a wheelchair. My brother organised it all for me and we hired a chair in Florida once we got there. It was really good. It was delivered to the hotel and we had a problem with it about a week in where we had to have it replaced, and they dropped a new one to the hotel. We picked it up from the lobby. It worked out really well. It was perfect, it was ideal, and for the fortnight and the damage waiver I paid the equivalent of 150 quid, which actually I think is a really good price, and was very impressed with that. So I am not a wheelchair user on a regular basis. As I have already said, I've used a wheelchair occasionally when I've needed to. My reasons for not wanting to go into a wheelchair, because for me personally, it feels like I've given up. It feels like if I get into a wheelchair, that's it. I'm never going to walk again. For me personally, that's what it feels like. Now, I am not a regular wheelchair user, so I don't want to come across as moany or ungrateful or horrible or anything. This is basically my experience with my feelings, my emotions, how I felt being in a wheelchair. I just want to give you a little bit of an insight into what it was like for me. So, as I've said, the process for us hiring the wheelchair in Florida was really easy. It worked out really well for us, worked out really cheap for us. The wheelchair itself was folded up. It had wheels so I could manually move it around myself if I wanted to. But for the majority of the time, my husband or my brother pushed me around in the parks. So the first thing I noticed about the wheelchair is that people really stare at you. I got a lot of glances whilst I was in the wheelchair. To be fair, in Florida, there were very, very few people with brightly coloured hair. Whilst I was on holiday, I had pink and orange hair. It was big, it was bright, it was bold. I'm also, as you know, covered in tattoos, and I was in sort of strappy dresses nearly all the time I was away. So my tattoos and my hair are very, very, very visible. So I get that people glance at me because of that more so than the wheelchair. But what I found was, as soon as somebody noticed that I was in a wheelchair, they look you up and down. They have a good look because they're trying to work out what's wrong with you. That's what it felt like for me. They're trying to work out, is she so disabled that she needs to be in a wheelchair? Oh, she looks relatively normal. And you can see these thoughts going through their head. You can see them trying to work out why I'm in the wheelchair. Should I be in the wheelchair? Do I deserve to be in a wheelchair? And it makes you feel really uncomfortable. For whatever reason, when people are staring at you, it makes you feel uncomfortable. I'm always quite paranoid about people staring at me anyway, because I walk funny. I have a significant limp. I throw my hip out a lot when I walk, so I do walk really weird and awkwardly. So I always feel like people are looking at me and laughing at the way I walk anyway. So I'm not sort of unused to people giving me that like side eye. But being in the wheelchair and having those people look at you added a real vulnerability to it. And that's my next point. Being in the wheelchair made me feel very, very vulnerable. You're being pushed out into roads first. You've got no control on what the person that is pushing you is doing. So whilst my brother and my husband are excellent at pushing me in a wheelchair, the people around you are not so good at noticing that quite a heavy piece of kit is coming towards the back of their ankles. And when you're in big crowds, and there are big crowds in America, I constantly felt like we were going to drive into someone, and it made me feel really vulnerable. Things were crashed into. I was driven into the occasional wall or the occasional display in a shop. In Universal, the resort that we stayed, there's a walk called the Garden Walk between Universal Studios, the theme park, and our hotel. There's like a walk, a really nice walk. You have to go over a bridge at one part of it, and the bridge so it's all ramps, but the bridge, for whatever reason, the way it had been built with like a lip at either end of the bridge. So you came up the ramp and then there was a step about that big before you went onto the actual bridge. And my brother didn't notice the ramp, and I nearly got thrown out of the chair, and it felt really scary for those sort of couple of, not even seconds, for that second as we hit that ramp and I jolted forwards. I felt really vulnerable. I felt like I had no control over what was about to happen to me, and I felt really unsafe. And that was heightened by the fact that I was in a wheelchair and I was completely sort of immobilised at that time. I was unable to protect myself or do anything, and that felt really scary. So yeah, being in the wheelchair did make me feel quite vulnerable. And I don't like that. I don't like that at all. That's not something I can get on board with. I like being in control. There is so little about my disability that I can control. So that when even more of that is stripped away, it makes you feel quite anxious. It's quite distressing just to have that extra bit of yourself stripped away. So I found that really hard. The other thing I found hard was my loss of independence. I loved to go in the shops, and the shops in Disney were immense, and sat in a chair being pushed around, I had no real control over where I wanted to go. So my husband, yes, he pushed me where I wanted to go, so I said, oh, I'd like to look over there, so he would push me over there. But as you're being pushed in a wheelchair by a hot and stroppy husband, you see something out of the corner of your eye. If you are on your feet, you'd stop and you could look at that. but whilst you're being pushed by your hot stroppy husband, you whiz past that and it's too late. It's too late to look at it. And if you try to say to him, well, can we just go back? And whilst 9 times out of 10 he is completely happy to go back and look at the thing I missed, occasionally he is huffy about it because he's hot, he's tired, he's had to push me around all day. I've been sat in a chair, he's been walking, he's done 30,000 steps and he's hot and tired. I get it. But I felt like I had no independence. I felt like I couldn't do anything. And it's really hard. It's really hard to be in that situation. Yeah, we went to the outlet stores one day and it was a really rubbish day for me because I was pushed around in the chair and I couldn't look at anything. In a lot of the shops, you don't fit around the aisles properly. You're constantly having to try and maneuver around displays or around people, and you can't look at anything. You can't look at anything up high because you're so low down, and I found that really difficult. Just sort of the memory of it now I'm finding quite difficult. It wasn't ideal. And yes, whilst I did get to look at all the things I wanted to, I don't feel like I could take the time that I would have usually taken. I would have wandered around that shop and I would have found all sorts of things and I would have had a really good look at stuff. But in the chair, you're very much committed to doing what the person pushing you wants to do. And I struggled with that a bit. One of the other big things I found was accessibility. Now, accessibility is already a problem for me because I'm not very mobile on my feet. So things like lifts and ramps, automatic doors, all that sort of thing make it a lot easier for me. Because I'm not great on my legs, having to try and pull or push open a big heavy door and stay upright and not fall over is a challenge for me anyway. Walking around a shop, if there's a small space, can be a challenge for me because I don't always feel steady on my feet. I often feel a bit wobbly, I walk a bit wobbly. I can be quite worried I'm going to fall over. So that's just stood up, walking around normally. Put yourself then into a chair that is wide. It's a wide chair. It's got big wheels. It's got big foot plates. You feel 50 times bigger than you are. And a huge amount of shops don't have the space for you. I was very surprised at how few of the shops we went into, especially in the outlet centre, had automatic doors. They were always big, heavy doors that we had to try and pull open. For me and my husband who isn't used to pushing a wheelchair, me who's not used to being in a wheelchair, having to try and get these doors open and then get into the shop as well, in and out of the shops, was really difficult, and it was embarrassing for me. I felt embarrassed. I felt mortified that I couldn't open a door properly. And the other surprising thing was that I always hold the door open for someone. If someone is behind me or coming towards me and I'm at the door, I'd always hold the door open because it's good manners and it's polite. The amount of people that will let a door drop in your face is phenomenal. And that's quite upsetting. It's embarrassing that you have to then try and struggle out of a door with no one to help you. And I found that quite shocking, that lack of accessibility. And I know from other disabled people, people with disabilities, I know that they have trouble with accessibility. So to see it myself firsthand opened my eyes even more, because whilst I strive for good accessibility, being in a wheelchair, there is even less accessibility. And I really thought that there would be more, especially in America. I thought that they'd be really hot on automatic doors and just people that would help you, and I was quite surprised at the lack of it, really. I thought it would be better. So yeah, accessibility wasn't great. Most of the time we got over it and it was fine. On the whole, I was treated pretty much like a regular person whilst I was in the chair. I have heard and read a lot of horror stories about people being treated as second-class citizens, disabled people being treated as second-class citizens, especially those in wheelchairs or with walking aids. And I was worried about how I would be treated, especially as I've read a lot of horror stories about people getting abused when they're in a wheelchair and then they stand up and walk around. I've heard a lot of people get abuse for that sort of thing. People shout rude things at them. They say make snarky comments. So that was one thing I was really worried about. And I'm easily upset, and I take things completely to heart. So if anyone had said anything to me, I would have been completely devastated. So I was quite thankful that nobody said anything. I think I did get the odd look, the odd glance, the odd whisper to their person that they were with, but that's fine. I can just about get over that. So a lot of the time, for example, if I wanted to go to the toilet, Neil or my brother would push me up to the outside where the sort of women's toilets were. They wouldn't come in with me because I don't really want them to, and nobody else wants my big old brother or my baby husband wandering into the ladies' toilet. So they would push me outside of the entrance. I would get up and I would walk in and then walk back out again. And the same for when we took our photos. I would get up, stand up for the photo, and then get back in the chair. So I was really glad that nobody sort of said anything snarky to me, because I don't think I would have handled it very well. The only time we sort of had an issue with someone saying something weird, and yes, whilst I could have been really offended, the situation was kind of funny, and I think the man's sort of proper Southern American accent is what made the situation slightly more hilarious. It was going through security to go into the Universal Parks to get into City Walk where all the restaurants are. And Neil pushed me through the security barriers, through the metal detectors, and then he had to stop and be scanned himself. And the man stood in front of my wheelchair, so stood sort of here in front of me, leaned over my head and asked my husband if I could stand. And Neil sort of went, well, yes, she can stand. And the guy said, oh no, it's fine, she can stay in the seat, it's fine. But I couldn't believe that rather than address me, he spoke over me, he stood over me, he leaned over me to ask my husband if I could stand. And at the time I was like, what? And we found it hilarious, and we have since talked about it, and we've done the accent, we've said what he said, and it's been funny. But actually, how dare he? And people do this to people with disabilities all the time. They treat you as if you can't speak for yourself, you can't stand up for yourself, you need an advocate. They assume you need an advocate. And that's quite hard. That's quite hard to get around, that he wouldn't have just spoken to me or asked me, rather than stand over my head and put his groin in my face to ask my husband if I could stand. So I think if I think about it too much, I'll be cross. So I'm just trying to see it for the quite funny moment it was. But that was sort of the only time we had a real problem. Everyone else was really great. The people at Disney, especially in the shops, would talk to me directly. They would take the money off me. They would hang the bags to me. I was treated as if the wheelchair wasn't there, and that was really nice. There was the occasional shop where they'd look to my husband for the money, or they'd look to my husband to give the bags to, or to take the things off, and assume that I wouldn't. Of course I wouldn't be holding. She's disabled, she's in a wheelchair, of course she can't hold a bag. But that didn't happen too often, so that was good. The thing about being in a wheelchair is people's butts. You spend a lot of time looking at butts everywhere. You're at butt level. It's just butts. It's a sea of butts, and that was difficult. That was annoying. But some butts are nice, some not so nice. It wasn't always pleasant. All in all, I find myself thinking that I'm fortunate that I don't have to rely on a wheelchair all of the time. Having spent 2 weeks, the majority of that time in a wheelchair, I am now much more accepting that actually I do need one sometimes, and I'm much happier now to go in it. It's not so much of a big deal. I've gotten over that bridge and I'm ready to accept that a wheelchair would be really beneficial for me. So I am going to be making strides to getting my own wheelchair. I'm going to go and speak to my local wheelchair services to see if we can get one for myself. I've got upcoming surgery now at the end of this year, so I think a wheelchair is going to be a really good investment for me. And having spent this 2 weeks in it, and actually it not being as horrendous as I thought it was going to be, I'm in a much better place to be able to say, yes, I could benefit from a wheelchair, I'm going to get a wheelchair. So that's my next plan of action. So I'm quite sort of optimistic about that. So yeah, that's a good step forward for me, I think. Yeah, I never thought I'd say that. But I think the time is right now for me to accept that my mobility isn't going to get any better. It's not great, and actually it's a drag on other people that I tire myself out from doing a little bit of walking and then can't do anything else. At least this way, whilst yes, they've got to go through the bummer of pushing my great weight around all day, but at least we'll be able to enjoy ourselves and get out of the house. So yeah, I'm willing to give it a go. My husband probably won't be so happy now because he's going to have to push me, but oh well, sickness and in health, right? There is a bonus to being in a wheelchair though. I'm sure there are many bonuses, but we did find that we got to get on buses and coaches and monorails first. We got first priority for that sort of thing. Occasionally we didn't even need to use the fast passes at Disney because there's a special wheelchair line and we got on first before everyone else anyway, so that was really good. We got front row seats for all the shows that we went to see, so that was really good. So yeah, we got a great view for the fireworks because there's like a special, not special, there's lots of them roped off areas where they put people with disabilities, people in wheelchairs, so that they get a sort of an unobstructed view of the fireworks, because obviously if you're sat down in a wheelchair and you're behind lots of people that are stood up, all you're going to see is butts. So actually having an unobstructed view in a designated area was really good as well. I really liked that. So yeah, that was great. So that was briefly my thoughts on how I felt being in a wheelchair for 2 weeks. Again, I'm not out to offend anyone. I'm not out to offend wheelchair users. These are my personal experiences of what it was like for me with my emotions and my anxieties being in a wheelchair. I felt there were pros and cons to it. I can see that before I was quite distrusting of being in a wheelchair. I didn't want to sort of ruin my mobility further by sitting down. That's what I thought would happen. I thought if I stopped, that's it, I'll never be able to walk again. And I did find that the more time I spent in that chair, the harder it was to get up each time. That was a little bit frightening. So that's it really. If you've got any comments or questions, then please get in touch below. As always, you can catch up with all my latest blog posts at www.estellosaurus.co.uk. You can check the links below, and I'll pop a link to my Instagram where I'm currently posting all of my Disney photos if you'd like a look. And I'll be back soon with another video. Bye! Thanks for watching.